The Denver Broncos end preseason on a high note with a 2-1 record after bouncing the Minnesota Vikings at home. How did the backup quarterback competition go? Whose favor is it leaning towards? Plus, who are some offensive and defensive players who stood out in Saturday's big-time victory for this Denver Broncos team ahead of the regular season? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite podcasting provider. Whether you watch us on YouTube, we appreciate you so much. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. Sayre, my friend, I tell you what, the Broncos preseason, week 3 to be exact, ahead of roster cuts. One thing we all wanted to see from this Broncos football team is could they respond from week 2's onslaught by the Buffalo Bills? And you know what? I think they did a pretty good job in this game.
They did. They wanted to come out and prove that last week wasn't a sign of things to come, really, in terms of this team's toughness, the way that they were going to kind of, go out there. They got smacked in the mouth by the Buffalo Bills. They wanted to make sure that everybody knew that they could go out and do the same thing. And you know what? It wasn't a perfect performance, but in the preseason, it never is. And I think exactly what we always want it to be, a great evaluating tool for a lot of guys that are competing. Just as Nathaniel Hackett told you, Cody, after the game, I was listening to the post-game press conference, and really it's an audition for every other team in the NFL. You're going out there, you're putting out, anything and everything that you do is going on tape for all 32 teams, not just the Denver Broncos, but for all of them to see. And so putting your best foot forward, I think we saw a lot of Broncos players in this game fighting for a roster spot, whether that's in Denver or somewhere else. And certainly on both sides of the ball, a lot of excitement.
It seemed like we saw a lot from a lot of players who knew that they had to prove something. They had to send a message tonight to the Broncos, the personnel department, saying, hey, you know what, give me a shot at the 53-man roster. And we'll see how things go this week. Obviously, we'll have you covered here at Locked on Broncos. Once the 53-man roster is official, we'll go through all the cuts, practice squad additions, and more. But let's talk about the backup quarterback job here for this Broncos team. Brett Ripon getting the start in this game. Josh Johnson will get reps in the second half of the action here. And one thing, Sayre, I'd say the narrative on this backup quarterback competition is that it really is kind of a 50-50 decision. It's kind of up in the air right now. Brett Ripon, his first drive, he led a very impressive 13-play, 84-yard drive going 8 of 10 passing, but he was intercepted, and it wasn't his fault because he threw a pass into KJ Hamler. A Vikings defender got his hand on it, knocked it up into the air, and then another Vikings defender came away with the interception in the goal line there. It was a super promising drive, but I like the way that he commanded the offense. I like the way he was able to get guys downfield and how decisive he was with the football. That was an impressive drive. And then, he'd go on to lead a scoring drive in the second quarter on a 5-play, 70-yard drive that featured a 45-yard pass to Seth Williams. And then Montreal Washington will cap it off with an end-around touchdown, his first touchdown of the preseason. Ripon would finish 14 of 21 for 137 yards and 1 interception. But for those that didn't watch the game, they're going to see that 1 interception and say, oh, he threw the interception. Josh Johnson didn't. Josh Johnson should be the backup quarterback. In my opinion, I still felt like Ripon commanded the offense much better in this preseason finale.
I did as well, and I think it kind of cements what we had talked about after that Buffalo game, that Ripon seemed like he might be in the lead for the job. And I think as of right now, that's kind of where things should be, right? As you said, commanding the offense, really moving the ball. I think the one thing with Brett Ripon that stands out to me about this preseason, other than the fact that I do think he did a good job of kind of orchestrating the offense, running the plays, making a lot of the throws, I think a couple of really long drives ending in 0 points for him is disappointing. Like you mentioned, the interception there, I couldn't help but feel like the Broncos were kind of trying to force the ball to KJ Hamler, get him a target there in the red zone period. And maybe that's what they were trying to do. And if that's the case, great. It's a live game rep for KJ Hamler, but what happened, Ripon through the interception. And I think definitely when you compare his performance over the last 2 weeks, even over the course of the whole preseason to Josh Johnson, just feel a little bit more comfortable in terms of what Ripon has been able to do, kind of just guiding the offense down the field. Josh Johnson had a couple of big splash drives in that first week of the preseason. And then against the Buffalo Bills, kind of starting quote unquote defense in that first drive last week, he had a solid performance as well. But other than a couple of, it just didn't feel like he was quite moving the ball as efficiently as Ripon had been with the Broncos offense, regardless of which unit he was playing with or against. So to me, Cody, if we're putting together this 53-man roster right now, as the game is still fresh on our minds, I feel like Ripon is that QB2, and I feel like Josh Johnson's a guy that maybe he doesn't make that final roster, but maybe you try to bring him on as a veteran addition to the practice squad.
It's going to be a very tough decision, and I'm eager to see what the Broncos coaching staff does here. And, with Brett Ripon, we saw him push the ball downfield more than we simply did with Josh Johnson. Now, I will say Josh Johnson did have a couple of downfield throws. He had a 30-yard catch and completion to Jalen Virgil, the undrafted rookie free agent. And then he had, I think, a 19-yard pass as well to Seth Williams, if I'm not mistaken. But, Josh Johnson would finish 11 of 14 for 107 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. But the one thing I noticed, he became very check down friendly. Like the running back was his best friend in the preseason finale against the Minnesota Vikings. And we'll talk about Devine Azigbo and Mike Boone a little bit later on here in this show. But in your opinion, Sayre, there was an interesting note by Mike Kliss on 9 News during the broadcast where he alluded to the fact that maybe the quarterback too, maybe the backup quarterback for the Broncos this season isn't on the roster. I personally don't feel like that's the case, because who else are you going to bring in that can maybe solidify that? Unless the Packers somehow release Jordan Love, I don't see that happening. I don't know. I feel like Brett Ripon should be the guy at this point.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what teams do. You watch enough preseason games, you kind of get to see, which teams have 3 quarterbacks that are worth keeping around, or which teams have 3 quarterbacks that they have to pick 2. I mean, maybe something happens with Mason Rudolph and the Pittsburgh Steelers. It sounds like he's done pretty well for them, but I don't know if he's an option or if you want him to be an option. Certainly not. So, I mean, it's guys like that, though. Those are the names that are on the list, unfortunately. So if that's where the Broncos are going, is it going to be a popular decision, or is everybody just going to be like, well, why didn't you just keep Brett Ripon, or, those type of things. So it's got to be, in my opinion, it's got to be kind of a clear upgrade. It's got to be kind of an obvious fit in terms of the scheme, or, there's plenty of coaches on this, coaching staff who have had experience with a variety of quarterbacks at their variety of previous stops. So it'll be fascinating to see which teams get rid of which quarterbacks and which could be tied to the Broncos. I'm sure we'll all find out as those roster moves start trickling in, but it's one of those things where, is it a clear upgrade over what the Broncos have shown and the guys who have been working in the offense all offseason? That's the question to answer.
That is the question for Broncos country. But who are some of the offensive standouts from the Broncos' 23-13 victory against the Minnesota Vikings to wrap up the preseason? We take a look at that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode of the show, of our post-game report. That's our good friends over there at Brightco. And there's a video circulating around the internet of this guy who was trying to propose to his girlfriend on a pier, and he dropped the proposal ring inside the pier. It fell through the crack and was lost at sea. Make sure you don't run into that situation here. So here's the lesson. You don't want to be that guy, and you certainly don't want it to be splattered all over the internet. The guys at Brightco Jewelry Insurance will make sure that you get a replacement for the full value of that ring, no matter if it's lost, stolen, or you just can't figure out what happened to it. Go to bright.co/locked-on. It's the fastest and the easiest and cheapest way to cover your butt with the best jewelry insurance in the business. And these guys at Brightco are geniuses. They've made buying insurance for your engagement ring, your watch, or whatever so friggin' easy that you can get covered in 2 minutes on your cell phone. You won't find a better deal on great coverage that's super affordable. Bright.co/locked on. And our good friends over there at Turo. And Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. And with Turo, you can book any car that you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. And you can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., Canada, or the UK. You can book a spacious SUV or a minivan for a family road trip. You can get a classic or luxury car for a special event, birthday, or holiday, and you can find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and you just need to get from A to B. Test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on to see how it fits in your everyday life. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms and conditions and exclusions apply. Ditch boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. The Broncos offense looked much more improved against the Minnesota Vikings in their preseason finale. Which players and what areas stood out? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch us on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. Sayre, my friend, let's break down the offense here. Outside of, we talked about the backup quarterback job, there were some other players that really stood out in this game. And I really wanted to give a little bit of a head nod here to running back Mike Boone, who got the start in this game. I tell you what, Boone demonstrated some flashes of electricity and got the run game going, just got the momentum going, and his vision, his footwork, it all compiled, and he had massive runs all over the Minnesota Vikings defense. And you know what? I mean, I don't think it was ever in question, but he is running back 3, and I even tweeted it out. I would not be shocked if you see a guy like Mike Boone sprinkled in to this offense with Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon.
Well, I think he's got to be, after what we've seen the last couple of weeks, just his ability to make people miss, his elusiveness, his speed and quickness, and like you said, that footwork, just in those tight areas, gaining those extra yardage, where he's creating offense. And I think that Mike Boone has shown, obviously, his development over the last couple of weeks has nothing to do with guys that are looking to make the roster. Like you said, he's a lock to make the roster, so he's making the team. It's now just a matter of what kind of role are they going to give him. And I think in this kind of an offense, man, he's kind of the perfect fit. He's a perfect one cut back and somebody that can really be elusive in the open field. I see Mike Boone having a big impact for the Broncos this season. And special shout out as well to the offensive line, which looked much, much better in this game. I think they took it a little personally, as they should, the way that they played against the Buffalo Bills. And yes, the competition, again, it's different, but at the same time, you got to go out there, you got to execute your blocks, you got to execute the scheme, you got to pave the way. I think they did a much better job in this game. I'm pretty sure the Broncos' top 3 ball carriers averaged over 5 yards a carry in this game, Cody. So certainly some good things in that regard. Really, really impressive. And I think Mike Boone, you're right. He really showed some things in this game to make you think, man, how can the Broncos kind of forcibly get him involved in the offense? They've got to find some touches for him throughout the season. He can't just be sitting on the sideline and wasting space over there. He's got to be on the field. He's too good to leave on the sideline.
No, I agree with you there. The offensive line, one thing I don't think has been talked about enough, like they haven't given up a sack outside of the one in Buffalo. It was the 4th and goal where Brett Ripon, should have just thrown it into the end zone. And, hey, if a receiver comes down to their tight end, so what? But he, gets sacked at the end of the game there. I've been impressed with the offensive line actually keeping quarterbacks upright so far in the preseason. I don't think that's been talked about enough there. And for Cam Fleming, who was also getting some good reps at the offensive tackle position in this game, I thought he had a solid night on first glance. We'll have to go back on the rewatch. But some other news and notes too. We talked about running back. Devine Ozigbo had some flashy plays for this Broncos team. For a guy who's just brought in this past week, keep an eye on him on the practice squad. He's not going to make the 53-man roster, but the Broncos are targeting him for a spot on the practice squad, and rightfully so. He earned it, and he looked really, really good outside of Mike Boone. If Mike Boone didn't have the night he had, Ozigbo would have had the best night out of all the tailbacks there. So there is that. But a little bit of a concern is there was an injury on the first or second play of the game here for the Broncos, and wide receiver and one of the camp standouts, preseason standouts, Brandon Johnson, suffered a high ankle sprain and was seen on crutches after the game. This is a little bit of a concern because of just the impact that he's been making all throughout training camp, all throughout the preseason. Now seems like this injury, as we know, high ankle sprains, they could linger a little bit. We do not know a definitive timeline just yet on him, but how might this impact the Broncos roster decisions at wide receiver?
To me, this is really tough. It kind of shakes things up again. We've talked in the past about how do you quote unquote replace Tim Patrick. Well, the Broncos chose to do it with in-house guys, and so we kind of expected them to take at least 1 or 2 of these guys that showed out in training camp and the preseason, and keep those guys on the active roster going into the season. But now you have one of your top guys that kind of showed up and showed out in place of Tim Patrick. Now he's got a high ankle sprain. Who knows how long that could keep him out? We know those can be kind of tricky to come back from, especially for wide receivers. But man, it's brutal because all the talk right now, and we talked about this before, everything that I was hearing during the game from, Mike Kliss came on, and you hear the announcers talking about this, and who knows who's piping them information. But Tyree Cleveland is the guy that his name keeps popping up. I know he's coming off the throat injury. It sounds like the Broncos, special teams coach Dwayne Stukes really thinks highly of Tyree Cleveland. So does he kind of just slide right back into that spot? Because we saw inconsistency throughout the preseason and training camp from guys like Seth Williams and Jalen Virgil and those type of things. Are they 53-man roster ready, or are those guys more practice squad ready? It'll be fascinating to see, but it sounds from, based on this injury, Cody, it sounds to me like Tyree Cleveland may have just slid right back into a roster spot here if he wasn't already guaranteed one, based on the things that Mike Kliss was saying, based on the things that the announcers were saying, and just really believing in his ability as a core special teamer. So Seth Williams, though, he did go out and have a nice game against the Minnesota Vikings here.
Yes, he did. 4 catches for 68 yards, including a 45-yard catch from Brett Ripon, but also Jalen Virgil, also 4 catches, 58 yards. Once again, showcasing some explosiveness as a receiver. He did have a little bit of a muff up on the opening kick return where he lost it in the light, muffed it, and it went out of bounds at the 3-yard line. And ironically, both backup quarterbacks started their first drives of the game on their own 3-yard line, which is crazy. Not sure how often you really see that happen. And then look at tight end like Eric Tomlinson, surprisingly enough, once again, getting acclimated, a couple of catches on the evening, 2 catches for 24 yards. And I tell you what, his size and his physicality is on display, especially as a blocking guy too. But now that he's leaking out there for passes, who knows how everything's going to go. One thing is for certain, the Broncos offensive coaching staff and the personnel department alongside George Payton, they have some very, very tough decisions to make in Broncos country. Send us some of your predictions down below in the YouTube comment section. Which wide receivers you think the Broncos keep and which ones you think will be released and hopefully brought back on the practice squad. Drop those comments down below right here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. But coming up here in just a moment, we're going to focus on some of the defensive standouts for this Denver Broncos football team, including a defensive lineman who needed a big game and came through. You get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Prize Picks, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos post-game report. In week 1 of the 2022 NFL season, I'm taking Russell Wilson to throw for more than 320 passing yards against his former team. I'm taking Derrick Henry to rush for less than 85 yards in the opener, and for Cooper Kupp to score more than 0.5 touchdowns, and Tyreek Hill to catch less than 3.5 passes, all with Prize Picks. You get to pick 2 to 5 players, and if they will go score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry and no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. And if you deposit $50, Prize Picks will also give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. The Broncos defense turned in a much better performance against the Minnesota Vikings than they did the Buffalo Bills in the preseason finale. And there were a couple of standout players on the defensive side of the ball and some players who made a strong case to make the active roster. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day. Tuning in on your favorite audio podcasting platforms for free and available everywhere you get your podcast, not to mention watching us here on YouTube. Don't forget to hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content coverage, and more. All right, Sayre, hey, let's break down the defense. You know me, I'm a defensive guy. I have my binoculars up in the press box, and I tell you what, you get a really good view with the binoculars, the on-field stuff. I felt like I was there on the field being able to watch that. But I tell you what, there are just some standout players. And one of the players we mentioned in a previous episode, our last episode of the show here, players who needed to have a big game against the Vikings, tell you what, they did. And let's start off with McTelvin Agim. He had a really good day for the Broncos, disrupting the quarterback. He came away with a couple of sacks. He also came away with a couple of passes deflected at the line of scrimmage. Now, it was interesting enough. He had a strip sack, and it was not credited to him, which was really odd because you see it clear as day. I imagine the NFL will go back and review and change that, but he had a really, really good game, and it was something that I think that he needed and the Broncos needed to see from him. The question is it enough to make the 53-man roster? And then outside of that, who was another player that stood out in your eyes?
That was it was a whale of a game for McTelvin Agim at the perfect time, right? I mean, it's just couldn't have been more perfect timing coming off of really the low of lows. I mean, and he was kind of I won't say he was the scapegoat. Everybody on the defensive line played poorly, but you kind of expect more out of a guy who's a third round draft pick in his third NFL season, right? So the pressure was on for this game, and he delivered, especially in the passing game, right? He was out there deflecting passes, like you said, getting after the QB, making plays. He made an impression, whether it was for the Broncos or somebody else. Again, we'll bring that up. You never know. His trade value could be there for some other team. Maybe some other team wants to go and trade for him now instead of letting the Broncos let him, subject him to waivers or anything like that. But he was definitely a standout, and it was great to see. I mean, he needed that game. And Delarian Turner-Yell, I felt like, was another player, the rookie safety out of Oklahoma. He was another guy that needed a big game, because we had talked before that J.R. Reed was kind of that guy that if the Broncos only keep 5 safeties on the active roster, well, he kind of seems like the guy that was going to make it. And he had a solid game as well. But Delarian Turner-Yell was out there flying around. I mean, he was shades of Kareem Jackson out there. He was kind of flying around with that kind of reckless abandon in the way that he played. There was even a sequence there for, I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 plays or maybe more than that, but he was in the blue tent getting evaluated for a concussion, I believe. And all of a sudden he's back out there on the field, and all of a sudden he was hitting Kellen Mond for a sack. So he cleared that concussion protocol rather quickly and then got back out there and made a big play. He took advantage in a big way. And to me, Cody, based on the way the Broncos have their cornerbacks right now and the way that they've played over the preseason, it wouldn't shock me to see their initial roster have 5 corners and 6 safeties. I believe we've mentioned that before, but if they're going to keep 11 DBs, which I expect, that could be the route they go with some of the versatility these guys bring to the table. Because to me, Delarian Turner-Yell and J.R. Reed, for that matter, have stood out more than any of the other corners on this roster throughout the preseason.
Well, massive shout out to that kind of goes to, where Turner-Yell came in on that sack on Kellen Mond. It was a negative 9-yard loss, and it was on 4th down, by the way. So that was a huge play for him, especially as Kellen Mond trying to get outside. But you know why Kellen Mond was trying to run outside? Because he had Aaron Patrick all over him, chasing him, trailing him. I felt like the Broncos edge rushers in this game did a tremendous job of creating pressure and creating different opportunities. We saw it with Baron Browning, who also got a quarterback hit earlier on Sean Mannion. He and McTelvin Agim, who Agim knocked it out. Baron Browning picks it up, runs it in for a touchdown. So when you can score on defense, and the way that they did it with the stunt, it was poetry in motion. There is that. So let's talk about edge rushers. Aaron Patrick had some good plays on tape, demonstrated, I think, some speed, some strength, and also some special teams ability. Then you go to Jonathan Cooper, who also had a sack in this game, and especially for a guy who's been limited in his capacity with the finger surgery that he had, really coming into Buffalo last week, getting his first NFL action of the year, and then carrying it over with a really good game, in my opinion, against the Vikings. Makes things very tough. But then, hey, shout out to Nik Bonitto for breaking out finally. Mentioned earlier on in the week that he was kind of in a slump a little bit, thinking a little too much. He comes out and he gets 2 sacks in a row. He almost had 3 sacks in a row, back-to-back plays there. It was a great performance by the Broncos edge rushing unit, and it makes things very difficult for this personnel department, in my opinion, to have to decide who to keep and who to release.
It's going to be brutal, right? They have 7 guys right now, and 8 if you include Jonathan Kongbo, who we'll see what they kind of thought of his preseason performance, training camp performance, based on whether or not he gets on the practice squad. But man, it's going to be tough for George Paton and company to make decisions off the edge. Those guys are so talented, and you've got to hope at this point that you've got a trade suitor for somebody like Malik Reed. To me, Cody, Malik Reed, unlike Jonathan Cooper and unlike other guys on this team, he's not under contract for the next 3 years, and he has a bigger contract than a guy like Jonathan Cooper. So just in terms of team building, roster building, the fact that Jonathan Cooper is showing off his athleticism, he's showing off that, man, he's kind of coming in cold, so to speak, with, like you said, last week was kind of his first week out there, and he's coming in cold, and he's showing that he can get after the QB and he can make some high impact plays off the edge. And also he was out there with the top special teams unit again this week, flying down the field, making a play on one of the kickoffs that I saw. So certainly, to me, Jonathan Cooper is another guy, along with Aaron Patrick, that they can be core special teamers, and that has to factor into your overall decision. Because yes, Malik Reed has the experience, but at the same time, I think these other guys have shown a lot more. And you moved Baron Browning there for a reason. You drafted Nik Bonitto for a reason. It wasn't necessarily because you thought, hey, Malik Reed is a guy that we can build around. but I think he has some value to another team out there that might need some edge presence. But yeah, you're right. It's tough decisions 1 through 7 at that spot.
Ooh, it's going to be a tough one here for George Payton. And, I was thinking about it during the game because the Broncos special teams unit, for the most part, I feel like, we talked about punters. I feel like you and I are in agreements. Corliss Waitman, we feel like should win the job. We'll see how things go there. But I do not want to be a special teams player because I feel like they're going to feel the wrath of Dwayne Stukes. It was not a very clean game in terms of the, kick coverage and some punt kick coverage as well. There were some big lapses there. The return game, some muffs and some missed opportunities. Yeah, I was thinking about that in the press box. Like, man, Dwayne Stukes, if I could just get my eyes on him, I couldn't find him in the binoculars. Like, man, he must be livid at some of the little miscues that have been happening, in that game. So we'll see how things pan out. But, one thing is for certain Broncos country, the team will have to make roster cuts from 80 to 53, and it could happen as soon as Sunday. We'll have you covered here, the Locked On Broncos podcast, with all the news, updates, analysis, and more every single day, all year long. So thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Make sure you do that every single day, or you can watch us on YouTube. Hit that subscribe to that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of coverage. From Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, Cody Roark, we'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.